Hope everyone had a nice mini break. I am so excited to introduce Natalie Vais, and I know she has her own more in-depth intro within the context of her talk, so I'll just do the summarized version. Natalie is an investor at Amplify Partners. She's a database aficionado and generally just like a really amazing person to be around. She has a real talent for distilling complex technical concepts into like simple explanations that anyone can understand. So I think we're all in for a treat with this talk. And just as a throwaway fun fact, last week I was talking to a founder and they said they would give up 10% of their company if they could just hire Natalie. So that's like not a vote of confidence. I don't know what is, but yeah, like Natalie's an investor in a lot of cool database startups, including Tiger Beetle, Ready Set, if I do say so myself, and like Mother Duck, as well as a few others. So without further ado.
Thank you. I actually got this mic, yeah. Thank you, Alana, for the introduction. I am so excited to be here. This is actually my first time in Cape Town. I traveled all the way from another beautiful city by the water called San Francisco. So I'm very excited to be here. And today I'm going to be talking to you about investing in systems. We've heard a lot of great talks so far. That sort of cover the technical element of building distributed systems. And today I want to talk to you about, from an investor's point of view, how we actually evaluate and think about how these systems can turn into companies. So to kick this off, I'll tell you a little bit about what I'm going to walk through today. So I'm going to start with a little bit more about my background and what my journey was to the investing side of technology. I'm going to cover some basics on investing. What is VC? What do investors actually do day to day? How does Amplify Partners work? How they're different from other funds? How we make investment decisions. And then more specifically, I'm going to dive into how we invest in academic projects versus open source and how we think about systems in the context of both of those topics. So a little bit more about myself and my journey to investing. I started off, before going into industry, I studied industrial and systems engineering, which was sort of the intersection of physical systems and digital systems. So the industrial part was really focused on kind of supply chain, the movements of goods and services, and the digital systems was really like the movement of bits. And so for me, systems have kind of been on my mind since, way before I started working in industry, which is why I'm really pleased and excited to be here at this conference, Systems Distributed. Out of college, I started working at Oracle. I was on the database team as a solution architect. If you're not familiar with that role is, you're basically kind of front deployed, deploying the software on site for customers. So many of my peers at the time were going to cloud companies, and I went to an on-prem company, which was like kind of uncool, but I was also super grateful in the end to kind of see what the serverful world looked like, because eventually I made my way to a startup where we were building a database that was sort of in the middle of cloud transition. We were doing a hybrid cloud deployment for a distributed time series database. That was sort of my foray into the startup world initially. That's sort of where I think I got my love for entrepreneurship, seeing kind of the early days of a project. And ultimately that company, I saw it grow from 20 people to 80, $0 to 10 million. We didn't ever grow past that, which is okay. So I also have a lot of learnings about the missteps that can happen when you're building a company as well. After that, I moved on to Google. I was originally on the core infrastructure team there, which basically served the developer platforms and tools for all the developers under the Alphabet umbrella. And then I was the product lead for Cloud Firestore. I think at some point I realized that I missed being in startups, and I approached Amplify about companies in their portfolio that would be interesting to work for. That conversation evolved, and I ended up joining the investment team, which is where I've been for the past 2.5 years. So what do VCs do? Can anyone tell me what VC stands for? Yes, venture capital. It's okay, it doesn't stand for video conferencing. That's actually what we called it at Google, VC. So here's like a formal definition of what venture capital is. Venture capital is money invested in a project in which there is a substantial element of risk, typically for a new or expanding business. Like this is like the dictionary definition of what venture capital is, if you look it up. As investors, we basically work with venture capital to make investment decisions in companies. So here's a quick history of venture capital. The concept of venture capital, as we know it today, modern day VC, is actually fairly new, new being the past like 50 or 60 years. Modern venture capital started as a way mostly to fund capital-intensive research when other methods of raising money were too expensive, like debt or taking like bank loans. It's also pretty hard to convince a bank to give you a loan if you tell them you have like no business plan, like might not be making money for like several years, but like need millions of dollars for the project. So that's actually where venture capital comes in to fund these sort of high-risk projects. VC officially became an asset class in the 60s, and that is sort of where it became the well-understood method that we know it today to be, where a company can raise capital in exchange for equity in the company. Then we sort of had the explosion of the internet and connected devices. That was when many of the biggest companies that we know today actually received venture funding. And to present day, I think about 50% of companies that are public started with venture capital funding. But that's also to say there's another 50% that never took venture capital funding to build their business. So I'll get to this later, but venture capital is not actually the method for any company and every company to grow. It's just one method to actually fund a project. So post-dot-com bust, we actually saw venture capital begin to specialize. So firms began to specialize by domain. They specialized by when they would enter the fundraising cycle for a company. And we also saw like the rise of accelerators, which lowered the barrier to entry for people to raise money for their startups. The most well-known accelerator is Y Combinator, which many people have heard of, and they've done a great job making venture capital kind of more accessible by also teaching people about what the fundraising process is like. So to illustrate sort of the growth of venture capital over the past 15 years, this graph shows the amount of money that has been deployed in venture capital over the years. You can see we had like a very unusual outlier year in 2021, and I think we are still trying to figure out what the corrections from that year will look like. Essentially, and what I actually don't have on this graph is sort of the dot-com bust, but if I had that up here, what you would see is another huge mountain of venture capital funding that went into the private markets that ended up kind of causing some problems. And so I think what we're trying to figure out what the next years will look like is what this correction from 2021 will be. But ultimately, the pattern here is venture capital is becoming a more popular way for companies to grow, and also the amount of money that's being poured into companies has increased over time. So how does venture capital work? I'm going to walk you through this structure for how we raise money to invest in companies. So we are actually sort of middlewomen to other investors, which tend to be large institutions or individuals who have kind of access to a lot of capital that they want to deploy over a long time horizon. So we, as a venture firm, we actually go out and raise money from these institutions, which would be, endowments, universities, nonprofits, pension funds, and we raise a fund that we then invest in a series of companies. So we, basically have a portfolio that's formed by choosing investments that we want to make in accordance with sort of our thesis or mission, and I'll get into more about what Amplify's thesis and mission is. And in exchange for the capital that we give these companies, we end up owning an equity stake. And over time, when that company does or does not do well, we either kind of realize a return on that investment or it goes to zero. And something about venture that I think is sort of well known at this point is like about 2/3 of companies end up failing and going to zero. So what that means is that like the 1 or 2 companies that do well, you sort of expect those to have outsized returns for your portfolio. So what are the flavors of venture capital? I talked about sort of how venture has evolved and how we've seen kind of a specialization of venture firms over time. There's two things I want to highlight, sort of this idea of a generalist fund and a specialist fund, and then specialization by stage of investment. So a generalist fund is a fund that sort of doesn't discriminate on domains. They may invest in consumer companies or enterprise companies. So this is really, a bunch of different business models that you'll see out there in the world. A specialist fund is one that decides to focus on a specific domain. For example, artificial intelligence, machine learning, developer tools. Early stage versus growth, that describes the stage in which the venture firm initially makes their investment. Are you coming in when it's one person or two people with kind of a blank slate and idea, or are you coming in when they've created an open source project, they have some level of traction or maybe even some revenue? That determines sort of the stage of the firm. As you can imagine, the check size that you'd be receiving at early stage is smaller than the check size you'd be receiving at a growth stage. So therefore, the funds are larger when you're working at kind of the growth equity stage. So venture is dictated by something called the power law. Depending, if you're a specialist, generalist fund, early growth, this is sort of the same across the board, which is to say that the only thing that matters is really the presence of like an outsized success in the portfolio for venture capital to actually work. In general, most of the investments that you make end up being money-losing businesses. And so the power law basically says that your returns will come from like a small amount of the companies that you invest in. The benefit really, though, for entrepreneurs is that it lowers the risk for starting a company as well. This is not like, taking venture capital funding is not taking debt. You're never expected to sort of repay that money that you've taken. It's a risk that venture capitalists take, knowing that they could lose 100% of the returns that go into the business. So I want to talk more specifically about investing in systems that amplify and how we sort of fit into the equation of thinking about companies to invest in. Amplify is a specialist fund, meaning we are domain focused on backing technical founders in a couple of domains, which range from infrastructure, developer tools, and applications of machine intelligence, AI, and ML. We also only operate at the early stage, so we're typically coming in before anyone has ever raised money. They typically have an idea, maybe they have a business plan, maybe not, but we're really looking for kind of early entrepreneurs that are starting their journey. Early stage typically means pre-seed, seed, and Series A, although those are sort of arbitrary labels at this point. They have been used to describe kind of the size of check that you would be receiving when you start the company. Being early stage investors also means that we have very long-term views of companies. We're often looking for businesses that will take, perhaps a decade or longer to actually work. And that's sort of the bet that we take by coming in really early with companies. Here's a sample of some of the companies in our portfolio. I highlighted a selection that are representative, although there's much more than this that you can check out on our website, two of which that are very exciting because they're represented here in the room today. And the other way that you can think about the three categories that I have up here is also about kind of the user that they're targeting. So developer tools and infrastructure are typically targeted towards like a buyer or a user persona that is a developer or someone that's writing code. In the category of machine learning and artificial intelligence, we're typically looking at a market that targets data scientists or machine learning engineers. So the tools and platforms that they use looks a little bit different than the tools that like a traditional developer would use. The third category, which is around data and analytics, that really targets a user persona that's closer to like a data analyst or a product manager, and these tend to be sort of higher level applications. So what do we look for within these domains, and how do we pick investments that we want to make in our portfolio? This really comes down to evaluating companies across three different vectors, the first being the market, the second, product, and the third is team. Questions that we ask ourselves about the market, how big is the potential user base for this product? Does the company rely on sort of underlying market shifts, which could be cloud or mobile or heterogeneous hardware or something that sort of the founder believes to be a change that's happening in the next iteration of time? Product, what are they building? Are they solving an acute problem? Or is it a technology in search of a solution? We see that a lot because it's really fun to do research and tinker on cool things. Not everything needs to be a company, and not everything can be, and that's okay. So we're often looking for something that is solving like an acute problem that people are feeling at their company. And then, importantly, is it something that people will actually pay for? Or is it a business where you're giving away something for free, but people aren't kind of willing to pay for additional services on top of that? The most important element that we evaluate on is team. Is this the right group of people to build the product, to navigate the market, and do they have kind of the domain expertise or a unique insight that's differentiated? I think team is the most important thing here because it's kind of the hardest to change. We've seen time and time again that companies kind of pivot ideas or products. You can even go after a new market, but the team is sort of the most fundamental thing. I think we kind of forget that technology problems are often people problems. I was thinking about some of the talks that we listened to yesterday about debugging and testing, and we talked a lot about kind of humans being an interface for communication. A lot of these problems boil down to like humans, and so team and people is, to me, the most important element of making a good investment. This is just an analogy that I thought would be fun. Investing, to me, it's sort of like kiteboarding or any like wind sport where you're relying on conditions that are out of your control. You can kind of do your best to have the prepared mind. You look up the forecast. You think like the good spot. But ultimately, the best rider could have the best gear, but without wind, you're not going to get up. It's also like surfing. If there's no waves, you're not going to catch anything. You have to paddle really hard to get into shore. So I think this is like a kind of fun analogy because weather is actually one of the most kind of complex systems out there, and I think the market is also one of the most complex systems to try to navigate with technology. I also think this wind graph is kind of funny because it looks a little bit like the market conditions of the past month. And so I think figuring out like where you are on that curve is kind of important. Is the wind about to die or is the wind about to pick up? So one of the ways that we like to think about investing is this idea of like being thematic or thesis driven. So Amplify and myself, like we are sort of a combination of the two. So the idea of thematic investing is choosing sort of overarching categories or themes that are interesting to you or that you believe have potential. An example of that would be like cloud infrastructure or mobile or ways to automate supply chain or kind of manual processes or observability in enterprise. These are sort of domains or areas that you could fish in for a long time and probably find like many, many companies. But what's sort of more interesting is to develop theses in these areas. Where do you think the shifts are going to happen? Or like, can you skate to where the puck is going? And so we think a lot about what are the overarching themes that we want to look into, but also what are our opinions or theses about what is going to be happening here. So some example theses would be vertical infrastructure will play a key role in the future because XYZ, or edge computing is the next major platform shift, which I know we heard from Derek, who seems to be very on board with that thesis. So I decided to write up a couple of exciting themes or thesis areas that I'm excited about. So I talked about vertical infrastructure. For me, the thesis there that I think is really exciting is that some of the biggest innovation drivers for cloud will come from specializing infrastructure for particular verticals. I actually think Tiger Beetle is a great example of this because they are building a specialized database that sort of brings the business logic of accounting and double entry accounting into the database layer. Why is that a benefit? Well, I think the cloud has given us like a really great set of general computing primitives, but at some point there's a lot of benefits you get from specialization, whether that's performance or cost optimization, et cetera. We've seen this happen at the application layer. We've seen this sort of rise of vertical SaaS applications, right, where you have workflows for construction or fintech or healthcare. But what we haven't really seen, and what I think will start to happen more, is specialization at the layers below, at the infrastructure layer. The second theme that I think is interesting, and I think a lot about whether this conflicts with the theme above, is the decomposition of databases. So one of the things that I've observed, at least within some of the bigger vendors, is sort of this separation of cloud and compute. I think Snowflake has gotten a lot of credit for architecturally kind of separating storage and compute to scale those things independently. What I'm starting to see too is that separation is happening between vendors. So there's these open source table formats, if you've heard of like Apache Hudi or Apache Iceberg, that are sort of building what they call the bottom half of the database. So my question is, what's the top half of the database that's going to be running on those open table formats? I think there's a possibility for kind of a proliferation of execution engines that can run on a shared storage backend. There's a really cool project that I'd encourage you to look up that was just recently announced out of Facebook called Velox. And Velox is sort of this componentization of execution engines. They had this observation at Facebook that they have like 15 or 20 different databases, and they sort of all have replicated parts that are similar to each other. What if they could pull out the parts that are similar and build that into a library that everyone could deploy? I think it's fascinating. I'm not sure how that will play out, but that's like a thesis that I'd love to debate with people on. The third is the convergence of machine learning and like data analytics stacks. Another thing that I think has happened over the past decade is that we've had two very bespoke infrastructures within enterprises come about, depending on the user that they serve. So we sort of have this, Python-based user base, and we have the SQL-based user base, and they often operate on the same data, but with using different tool sets. And what happens is that you're actually duplicating the same data within your enterprise like multiple times, and it's extremely costly. So my question is, will these stacks ever converge? Probably the biggest example is sort of the battle of the data warehouses. You have Snowflake and you have Databricks. And often people are storing kind of the same data in both places, but one is because people want to use Spark and Python to retrieve the data, and they're like data scientists, and the other is because they love SQL and they want to operate on like a hosted data warehouse. But ultimately, the data is the same, so maybe the decomposition of databases will help with converging those stacks. The fourth, which actually Jamie sort of mentioned in his talk and Derek also mentioned, is sort of moving code or compute to the data. I think these are two sides of the same coin. So the idea of moving code closer to data, I think, again, Tiger Beetle is a good example of moving business logic sort of closer to the infrastructure primitives. But on the other side, edge compute is about moving the compute closer to where the data is, and in this case, on the edge. So I think this is a big benefit because, with the proliferation of cloud and sending everything to a central server, you actually have a lot of round trips over the network that are inefficient, and that causes kind of the degradation of user experiences in some cases. But luckily, we have products, where's Alana, like ReadySet that help cache data at the edge. The fifth area that I'm very excited about is observability for serverless. So I think we kind of talked around the concept of observability, specifically like in Andrew's talk when he was talking about like making programming more accessible, building systems more accessible. I think observability is kind of one of the most important parts of building distributed systems. If you can build a system that's observable, it allows you to be introspective about it and understand what's going on inside the black box. And I think with cloud and by building these sort of abstraction layers for developers that's meant to simplify things, we've actually complicated things as well, which means you can't really see behind the box, you can't feel it anymore. So how do we build tools that allow you to like introspect the black box better? And the reason I also like this area is that for me, it sort of originated from control theory and physical systems where you actually have like outputs from a physical system like smoke or a light, and that tells you what's like happening behind the scenes. Software is like so opaque, it's digital. We don't have those like signals, smoke signals to tell us like what's going wrong. And so how can we build better tools specifically for like serverless architectures that allow us to introspect the system? So next I'm going to talk about sort of like investing in academic projects. in the early stage investing, we're often looking for things that are sort of at the inception phase that potentially have the ability to become a company. And one of those places is in academic research. So of the companies that I showed earlier in the portfolio, there's about 6 up here that actually explicitly originated from research in academia. ReadySet is a great example. Alana talked about sort of the Noria research that happened at MIT, which eventually was implemented in ReadySet. There's a lot of examples of sort of people exploring ideas in the setting of a university or their PhD program that eventually they're able to successfully turn into a company. So here's an example. Here's another way to frame that, which also shows sort of the paper that that research showed up in originally. And you can see there tends to be like a 2 to 3 year lag between kind of when the research comes out and when someone might just, contend with starting a company. So investing in open source, this is another really important element to investing, because I think open source is one of kind of the most critical ways to deliver software today to developers. Again, portfolio, the number of open source projects we have here is over 60%. And so this is becoming an increasingly popular business model for developers, but more specifically for companies and enterprise. How do you invest in something that's free? I got this question yesterday, and it's a really good question. There's 3 main ways that you can actually commercialize something that you're giving away for free. And the first is offering support and services around it. I saw some eyebrows here because I think that there's some companies that should be included or maybe shouldn't be included here, but Red Hat is actually probably the only example that I know that has successfully commercialized an operating system. And they did so by providing support and services. No additional features, no hosted platform, just support and services. I don't know if there will be that many more examples like that. What I think is going to become more popular are the 2 other business models. This one called Open Core, where you make money from charging for proprietary or enhanced functionality around the open source. And then the third, which is not, which you can do alongside Open Core, would be like a hosted platform SaaS. So that's where you're actually making money from hosting, tooling, or operations, which kind of lowers the operational cost for companies to run the open source software. Open source licensing models. So I think one of the trends that we've seen is that over time, open source licensing is getting more permissive. So the use of Apache or MIT has been going up over time. I think now over 50% of licenses have the more permissive format, which I think is kind of interesting, because there was a period of time where especially the big cloud providers were sort of seen to be exploiting the open source licenses. And so I think the pendulum has almost swung the other way again. There was a period where people tried to tighten up their licenses to kind of prevent other people from taking the open source project and hosting it. But I think people realize that ultimately it's sort of better for the developer to have these permissive licenses. So I think that's an interesting trend to watch. I think that getting more permissive is probably better overall for the developer experience. Does open source always succeed? Definitely not. There are a lot of startups that never make money. It's great when you actually do figure out how to commercialize something that you're giving away for free, but this is non-trivial. Open source is not a silver bullet for anything. In fact, there's as many open source projects that haven't seen the light of day as there are amazing open source projects that we all talk about today and use and leverage. So how do you actually build a successful open source company? Well, here's the tale of 2 projects, both of which started off as very successful open source projects that developers loved, and 2 companies that, one ended up successfully commercializing the open source project and one debatably did not. So Confluent is the company that ended up successfully commercializing the open source project Kafka that originally came out of LinkedIn. Docker was the company behind commercializing Docker, which was originally called .cloud. And this is sort of this example that's held up because it was one of kind of the most beloved projects of its time. But for whatever reason, like the company was not able to successfully monetize. So why was that? Was it because of the platform? Was it because Kubernetes came out of nowhere? Was it because of like the personality of Docker, like in the open source community? Like there's a lot of different theories about why this didn't work. But I think what's also interesting is like the sequencing of how like open source aligned with sort of the commercialization. So one thing that you can see from Kafka and Confluent is that the open source project actually existed for like a long time before they ever thought about commercializing it. So I think it had time to sort of sit within the community and like kind of gain adoption that way before they started to try to extract money from the users. And I think they also like more successfully figured out how to solve an acute pain and actually offer like an enterprise version around the product. Now Docker, on the other hand, they actually kind of started to like release 3 different enterprise products around the same time. And I think that ended up kind of confusing users. I think they also, at the expense of their open source project, like didn't really offer like value add services in the enterprise. So there's a lot of things that you can like, you know, kind of point to that would describe why this did or did not work. But ultimately, what it came down to is that Confluent was able to successfully build services around Kafka that people were willing to pay for, that they found value from, and Docker was not. So how, you know, do you sort of win the hearts and minds of developers to build a successful open source project? We kind of think about this frequently when we're evaluating projects that are open source, which is sort of the winning minds, the winning hearts, and the capturing of the developer love. So winning minds is really sort of about like the engineering side of things. Have you delivered a 10x better experience, or are you delivering kind of a new behavior that was not like enabled previously? So have you solved an acute problem? Number 2, winning hearts, which is really about the community. Have you like explicitly and intentionally figured out ways to foster the community, partner with the community, host events, and really become a voice there? And then I think like the third level, capturing love, is where your community becomes sort of the evangelist for you. They start contributing back to the project, and this is sort of the flywheel that feeds itself when you've ended up building like a great community around your open source project. So ultimately, it's pretty hard to get all these 3 things right, but I think getting all these 3 things right is really important to being able to build a successful company around open source. When you start a company around an open source project, keeping the community and fostering the community is the most important thing. And so I think one thing that like Confluent actually did really well was treating the open source community like one of their product lines. It wasn't just like a funnel or a thing that had their product out there in the wild. It was like something that they explicitly had like a roadmap for, that they explicitly invested in. And I think that that's very paramount for building a successful open source company. So what are some of the learnings from the open source companies that we talked about here today, but also the ones that Amplify is invested in? Number 1, always solve for an acute problem. So something, you know, again, this is sort of like, are you building a technology in search of a problem, or have you actually developed a technology that solves a problem that people acutely feel? I think that ties very much into whether people will ultimately be able to pay for this. Have you made their lives incrementally or massively better with the product that you've developed for them? Lesson number 2, becoming a standard. I think this is more important for some projects than others. Like I think specifically for like languages or operating systems, like becoming a standard is more important because you get like the flywheel and the benefits of having like more people using it. But I think with things like databases, like becoming a standard isn't necessary. But perhaps you want to become a standard for your vertical or your niche. The lesson number 3, which I think is the most important, is trust is very sacred. We've seen this time and time again with open source companies that have sort of lost trust of their community, it's super hard to gain that back. And so it's also hard when like you don't ultimately control your community, you're actually part of it. So I think the other thing is like you don't own your community, even if you are the owner of the open source project, you are a part of the community. And so I think that's an important distinction as well, which is like how can you be an active part of the community and also like keep the trust of developers. So I wanted to highlight 3 investment case studies from our portfolio, 2 of which are in the room here today, and sort of how we found those companies and how we decided that they were great investments. The first is ReadySet. So we actually, where is Alana? I keep referencing her, but I can't find her. Oh, there she is. Okay, so Alana was like a PhD student. I guess it was in 2019 or 2020 when I had actually just started at Amplify, and we had come across the Noria paper and been introduced to Alana and some of the other classmates that were working on this project. And we actually decided to give them an investment before they decided to graduate. And this was sort of a trial run for them to figure out if they could build something larger around Noria that people wanted to use. It turns out the answer was yes. And so we ended up leading not just their pre-seed, but also their seed round. And we've helped them now sort of build to the point where they are today, which is doing incredible things. And so I think ReadySet's an interesting example of not only open source, but also an academic project that has been able to find like a niche within developers that's solving a really acute problem. Tiger Beetle, I heard about Tiger Beetle from Jamie Brandon's conference, Hi Drop Boy. So this was a niche database conference that he hosted online, and as one does, you attend the niche database conferences. And I remember there was this one talk that stood out, which was Jorn's talk on building a custom LSM tree. And I was like, why would someone do that? Because there's like plenty out there that you could leverage yourself. And so I sent him an email and I was like, why are you doing this? And he said, not only are we doing that, we've also decided to write it in this new language called Zig. And I was like, why are you doing that? And he's like, well, there's this thing called static memory allocation. I was like, well, everything I've heard about databases says we shouldn't be doing that. So I was like, time after time, I was like getting challenged on these things that were like deeply entrenched for me of how to build a database. And I was fascinated because I think in infrastructure, you often see sort of incremental advancements. And I was like, okay, this team is doing things completely differently, and this is so cool. And also very much aligned with one of my theses that I was looking at, which was verticalized infrastructure. So it was sort of the perfect storm, and Jorn was, in fact, deciding how to potentially spin out of Coil at the time, and the rest is history, and now I'm in Cape Town. So that's exciting. MotherDuck is another interesting company that I wanted to highlight. I don't know if any of you guys have heard of the open source project called DuckDB. Yeah, it's awesome. Everyone loves DuckDB. So DuckDB was an open source project that actually, again, originated in academia from CWI, which is a university in the Netherlands. And DuckDB was sort of solving the problem that SQLite did, but on the analytical side. So they're an embedded OLAP database that's specifically targeted for sort of, smaller footprint use cases where you need to run analytical loads. And MotherDuck is an interesting use case because the original creators of DuckDB are actually not the founders of MotherDuck. So the team of MotherDuck is actually a bunch of ex-Googlers who worked on BigQuery, led by Jordan Tigani, who was the tech lead for BigQuery for many years. And he actually had this idea of building what he called small query, which is like BigQuery is often kind of overkill for a lot of the workloads that people have today getting started. And data warehouses, as easy as they are to use, they're actually like kind of a high barrier to entry if you're like a single developer that needs sort of like an analytical workload. And so, he had heard about DuckDB, and we actually set up this really unique situation where like DuckDB Labs is now involved in MotherDuck in a consulting capacity, and they also get to participate in kind of the success or upside in MotherDuck as a company. And so we'd led their, we were participating in their seed investment back in April. They've now raised a Series A as well. And again, very exciting new database company that both has an academic element and an open source element. So takeaways from working in venture for the 2.5 years that I have. I think number one, venture can be a very efficient way to scale an idea. the biggest thing that you get with raising money is the ability to hire people. And that's what, sometimes can make you move faster, but that's ultimately what people raise money for, is to build a team around the company. However, venture is not the right business model for all businesses. I think there's some open source projects that, again, won't necessarily have one of those three business models as a way to commercialize, but also you don't have to have aspirations to build something big and enduring. Venture capital is a tool that you can use if you want to build a company that's enduring, but it's certainly not the only way to do so. The second is you must always be solving an acute problem and create something that people want to buy. Otherwise, you have a solution in search of a problem, or you have a technology and not a product. From the startup that I worked at, I think this was sort of our failure mode, which is we had an incredible technology that a small subset of users could leverage, but ultimately we didn't really productize it. So technology is something someone can use, that's really cool. A product is something that someone can buy. And I don't think we really figured out how to productize a really awesome technology. The third is that team, product, and market are all really important, but I ultimately think team is the most important thing. It's the thing that's hardest to change, and it's definitely the most important element that I think I value when looking at investments, especially because we're thinking on a long time horizon. So that's it, and thank you, and I will take questions.
Thanks, Natalie. So glad that we happen to attend the same conferences.
Thanks, Natalie. That was awesome. You had a slide about open source licensing models, and you mentioned that it seems like companies are moving more toward permissive licensing. And I'm curious for you to expand on that, because I've kind of had the opposite impression recently with Elastic and Cockroach and MariaDB. Or it feels to me like there are more and more going the opposite way, having some open source, but if you run this in production, you need a license for it. So I'm just curious to hear more about your opposing view there.
Yeah, so I was actually very surprised by that data too. I went back and I looked, and I think it's gone up 5 or 6% since last year, the number of licenses that fall into the permissive category. The other thing is that is by number of licenses. So my inclination is that it's just easier for someone getting started with open source to do the most permissive licensing, but the bigger companies that we know of by volume are probably the less permissive. So I think in some way that could be a misleading slide, but I do think it shows that more projects getting started are doing the permissive license.
Cheers. Thank you, Natalie. That was, so cool to hear your perspective and the way you guys are thinking about investing in really technical projects. A couple, things. The licensing thing is fascinating to me. There just seems to be this real tension that you guys have in that you're a VC, so you need an exit, but also you need to also support a community and not kill that community by introducing these bad licenses, or the Docker example, kind of maybe some what you were saying there was they tried to commercialize too early, but don't you have investors that want these projects to commercialize and actually make money? How do you think of that tension? I've also got another question after this. So.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And we think about that all the time, and I think one of our jobs as very early stage investors is to alleviate that pressure. And it's another reason that we think a lot about fundraising milestones and what it will sort of take to unlock the next one. And I think what we're seeing is actually the seed rounds are getting larger for companies so that they actually feel less pressure to commercialize more quickly. So by giving someone a longer runway or a longer timeline to actually reach sort of the commercialization phase, I think you're alleviating the pressure a little bit. But I think that tongue-in-cheek slide about startups with revenue, 100% of the investments we've made pretty much have no revenue. So we're definitely not looking at that as a metric at all for companies initially.
Yeah, great. And then I know you've only been there, I think you said 2.5 years, but can you tell us your best exit and your best, your the time you were most wrong about a company? I don't know, you probably don't have to name names, but I'm just always curious to ask people.
So I've not been in the industry long enough to know if I'm doing a good job at it or not. But I can tell you that some of my partners that have been doing venture for a long, long time, I think they're most, let me go back to the portfolio study here. The two most successful companies in our first fund were Datadog and Fastly. So they were sort of the first investments into those, which ended up being like massive companies. And I think at the time it was sort of a contrarian bet for the investors that made them. Developer tools were like not a cool area to invest in at the time. And so they were like, nah, yeah, we're good. And it was also like a New York-based company. And they're like, but everything is based in San Francisco. So yeah, Cape Town's the next.
So yeah, people must think you're crazy for investing in a database based in Cape Town.
Absolutely.
I've got a quick question. Do conference ticket sales count as revenue?
No. Neither do good bank rates.
It's a pretty big pivot.
A follow-up question on the licensing. So it occurs to me, in my experience with open source, one of the things that protects a project from just being forked and replicated by a bunch of people who think this is a great project, we can make money off it, is the knowledge within the core team. Would you say that the advances we've seen lately in AI around understanding code bases and being able to actually provide feedback on the code is a threat there, where you can take an open source code base, feed it into a model and say, we want to take this code base and fork it in this direction, help us do it. It's a much lower resource sort of approach to stealing an open source project.
Wow, that's next level. I hadn't thought about that. That's interesting. I think to your point about like the way to protect the project is to have the core contributors. Like I think that's very much true. Like if you look at the most successful companies that have built around open source, they also have the main contributors as employees, which is also why I think MotherDuck is going to be an interesting experiment, because like they found a way to sort of partner with the original contributors, but they didn't have aspirations to join the startup ecosystem, and so we've put together a partnership for them that works. But that's a good question about using AI and ML to like steal code bases. So I'll get back to you on that.
Thanks. I hope this isn't too niche a question. You've talked a lot about how exits usually, one thinks about an IPO and that's when you exit. But if I think about developer tools, a lot of developer tools get procured by larger tech companies. And I'm wondering if you're aware of whether there's a differential between the exit multiples on whether you're acquired by a larger technology company or whether you IPO. Thanks.
That's a very good question. So I would say in general, acquisitions tend to be smaller exits, but not necessarily. I think now we're actually seeing companies not only take longer to go public, but also like larger, more strategic acquisitions, even things like Adobe and Figma or like GitHub. And I just think that I think that it's changing. Yeah. Yeah.
What's interesting is, adding to what Natalie was saying, is for founders, the most amount of wealth that was generated in the last 5 years has been companies that were M&A'd, but it wasn't through the M&A. It was on the last investment round where they participated in the round and took money off the table. Just keep that in mind. And the least amount was actually made in IPOs as a general consensus across all the people that were in the company.
Yeah, that's a good point. So there is something that's like been happening a little bit more because it's taking longer for companies to go public and reach that liquidation, is that founders are often doing sort of secondary sales of their shares. So when the company is still private but has reached a large valuation, they can actually kind of sell back some of their shares to investors. And so they're actually making money before like investors have made money, or like even the company has had an exit. And there's obviously some problems with that, as you might imagine, because they could take some money off the table and then like the company could fail like a year or two later. So it's an interesting dynamic.
Thanks for that. That was very clear. My question is, as an entrepreneur, how would one decide between taking on debt or getting venture capital?
I just definitely wouldn't take on debt because I don't see any upsides to that. Like I think that venture has done a good. Yeah. Did you want to add
Well,
to that?
I can clarify the upside. So I would be giving up no percent of my company. So I would get 100% ownership. And then if it failed, then my LLC declares bankruptcy and there's no problem.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's
I mean, a failed startup declares bankruptcy, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I think it's a very personal question too. I think that like the choice between bootstrapping and taking venture funding also has to do with like not only your risk appetite, but like what your aspirations are for the project. Like it might be something that you want to work on with like a smaller group of people for a long period of time, and you don't really care about growing that to be larger or hiring a lot of people. And in that case, like bootstrapping is a really good path. Yeah. And also bootstrapping, if you have a path to start making money faster, I think is smart. But if you think it's going to take a super long time, like venture tends to be a better accelerant in that case.
Thanks. Oh, so you might not get the loan. I see. Okay. Okay, so the venture capitalist will be willing to give you money. The bank will not be willing to give you money. That's a good answer.
Many startups might be in negative cash flow for a really long time for a viable business to be realized. Paying an amount of capital convention.
But if you have a yacht, you could use that as collateral, then the bank will give you a loan.
So I kind of think that developer tools and infrastructure is a terrible industry in the sense that most of these companies aren't able to capture any significant fraction of the benefit they bring companies. Like if you can make a big company's developers 5% more productive, you are saving them tens or hundreds of millions of dollars a year. But like nobody pays tens or hundreds of millions of dollars a year for software, like, or for developer tools, unless, and the few companies where they do, it's because they're like tricking them into paying for it by like thinking, like Snowflake, like you don't actually think you're buying developer productivity, you think you're buying compute and storage, right? So like, why is this? Why will nobody pay for these tools?
I guess I just disagree. And I think that's because I think I have to be an optimist in this job too, but like, I think I'm looking for the places that people are willing to pay, and we've found them. Like I actually do think Datadog and Fastly are really good examples of like massive companies that have figured out that developers will pay for those tools. But yeah, there's certainly a lot that people won't pay for, which is sort of where it goes back to the power law, which is like the majority of things will like not work and potentially go to zero. But the few that like do have outsized outcomes, like do save developers a lot of time.
Thank you, Natalie. I have one comment and then one actual question. People have been talking about open source licenses. As somebody who works in a 100% open source company, non-profit on top of that, I would recommend everybody to like not put that much value into the open source etiquette, because like the label, sorry, because you should look at who's on top of the open source initiative. And you should also keep in mind the difference between 501c3, so non-profit organizations that end with a 3, like the Python Software Foundation and the Z Software Foundation, and the ones that end with 6, 501c6, like other different foundations. Yeah, I could give examples, maybe not on the mic. So yeah, there's a big difference. Related to that, in the case of the Zig Software Foundation, I think that, Will, what you're saying makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of value that Zig brings to the table that everybody would be willing to use, nobody would be willing to pay for. In our case, what's working, and again, it's very different, right? This is not venture capital. This is like non-profit open source run on donations. Our product, in a sense, is storytelling. Like we have a relationship with our community where we try to make everybody informed of what we're doing, and that drives donations. It's cynical to think of it just as like a way of sucking money, but that's what gets people interested in what we do. And they get a nice compiler on top of that. Okay. Vaguely related to this, the actual question. Do you have any recommendation on how to keep control of the startup if I were to get venture capital, because I feel like I've seen some startups where it seems to me that they gave up way too much control, and at that point they were forced into completely corrupting their product, quote unquote, betraying the community because they were forced by the financial situation that they got themselves in. So do you have any advice on how to limit that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it has a lot to do with like the investors that you bring on board. Like looking at their track record is also really important. And this gets back to like the difference between venture firms. There are certain firms that are sort of touted to be more founder friendly versus ones that aren't. And that also goes back to your question about like control of the company. So when you raise money, you are giving up equity, which in some cases is amount of control or governance on your company. But you also like have a board, and the board can serve a good function too. There are cases like, you know, in public companies today where like the board has intervened to replace executives that aren't kind of being good stewards of capital or running companies well. And I think that's like a good example of where board governance is really important. But there's also cases where like I think founder control is really important. I think that there are ways that you can also like structure like deal terms differently. You also like can have independent board members. That's something that I think is sort of underleveraged or underused. Your board member doesn't have to be someone that like actually has invested money. It can be someone like from the community or like an independent person. So I think there's different ways to provide checks and balances. And there's a really big range. So it's a very good question, and it's something that is definitely up to like the founder and the investors to navigate together.
I just want to make a quick comment on what Will said. I think developer tooling and developer tooling and infrastructure is changing, or the demand and the willingness of companies to pay for it is changing because the voices of developers is getting louder within companies. So I think historically, developers were a cost center. They were the guys in the dark room in the basement who like made the stuff come out, produce the product for the company, especially if you're talking about line of business apps and so on. Whereas more and more companies are actually being driven by the developers and the technical teams. And so I think, the suits are looking at their spreadsheets and realizing if they can improve developer productivity, there actually is a number that's worth paying to do that. I think what may be interesting is to see how much better we can get at measuring that and really motivating for investment in that.
I think that's such a good point. And like what you just pointed out is something that we're seeing, which is like the buying power is shifting to individuals within organizations. It used to be that you had to go through like a procurement process, and you had to like get an invoice from like the CFO. And now like individual developers can put their credit card into like a company's like website and start using the product that way. And so they sort of democratize the access to purchasing developer tools to an individual. And that's also changed the way that you like sell into these companies. It used to be very much top down, where you had to get the buy-in from whoever it was up at the top. And now it's like you actually have to get the love and endorsement of the people that are going to be using it. So the user is now the buyer instead of the buyer being someone else. So completely agree. I think it's a really, really good point.
Yeah, just 2 points. Just I want to comment on what Larissa is saying. And I think I've had a lot of thought that in the past, founder-friendly was a good thing. I mean, we've seen over the last 2 years of how much they've taken advantage that that's probably not the case. I think the key here is at the end of the day, if you're willing to take capital from somebody, you got to realize there are LPs that are wanting a return on that capital. And having good governance is not a bad thing. It is a process that's required because there is a mechanism for them to take certain processes to evict people. I mean, WeWork's one classic example. Adam Newman ran that place like crazy, and that shouldn't happen. And the whole reason was because everybody's like founder friendly. Like I think the founder friendly is just a catchword to say like, oh, we're just gonna let the founder do whatever they want. I think governance is actually a good thing and should be there. Just to comment, I think the one thing that I would have liked to see touch on, and maybe you can just comment on it now, is in this day and age, there's plenty of capital around, and you talked a lot about just giving capital. So I think something to keep in mind for a lot of people when you take money is just one piece, and I would like to know what Amplify's differentiator is there, because I know when we're raising money, the money is the smallest part that we think about. It's what they can contribute to us through networking, etc. So yeah, if you can comment, that'd be
It's a
great.
Great question. I didn't want to turn this into a sales exercise for Amplify, but so yeah, Amplify, we have an investment team of 8 people. All of us come from the industries that we invest in, but in addition to that, we have something that's called the build team. And the build team is actually like specialized operators that come from different functions in industry, whether that's developer marketing or go-to-market or sales or talent recruiting. And if you are in Amplify's portfolio, you have full access to those people to help you with those functions. So I know that both ReadySet and Tiger Beetle have leveraged some of these functions with their launch announcements or as they're thinking through developer marketing. And so in addition to capital, which is, as you pointed out, commoditized, there's you can get money from so many different venture firms. I think how we have aimed to differentiate is to be specialized in the domain and to offer advice and consultation in the areas. I think beyond that too, it's the network of our portfolio. So when you're in our portfolio, you get access to the companies in it. And I think it ends up being a nice flywheel too, because we sell to developers and we invest in developer tools, then our companies end up learning from each other, partnering with each other, and it's a great technical network, which you might not get from a generalist fund that invests in a very wide range of things.
Amplify have also got Mark LaRosa.
Yeah.
So this is a slightly different way of asking Andrew's question. What are the most common patterns of incentive misalignment between investors and founders that you've seen? And what are some ways that both sides can avoid those most common patterns?
That's really interesting. So I think actually one very complicated dynamic is valuation. So I think founders get quite fixated on valuation as a way to measure the value of a company, of their company. And so I think there's this desire for it to be higher because it reflects what you're building is more important. The downside of taking high valuations early on is that the bar to raise the next round gets higher and higher. And so it actually can sometimes hurt the company long term if you take too high of a valuation too early. This is one of the conversations that I find hardest to have with founders because it is, it kind of puts us at odds with each other because we're saying, oh, we think you should take a lower valuation because of XYZ, which might increase our ownership. But the net of it is it's often better for the company too. And I think that's a hard conversation to have when founders are optimizing for lower dilution, which often means a higher valuation, but then it becomes harder in the subsequent round to raise a healthy valuation. And so that's actually a place that I haven't really figured out how to have the right conversations. Second time founders have figured this out, so they already know that, but I think that is really hard early on to have those conversations.
Right. The power law also implies that taking slightly more dilution for a slightly bigger chance of success is a really good deal for the founder.
Yeah,
right?
and that's also hard to the other thing that's hard is to Andrew's question about bootstrapping and also your question about control. It's also would you rather have a smaller percent of a larger thing or a larger percent of a smaller thing? Do you want to own 100% of a $10 million company or do you want to own 50% of $1 billion company? And so that is a question about control and risk and upsides, and that's also dictated by the power law.
Good. Last question. Okay, well, thanks so much, Natalie. It's been a real pleasure having you speak to us. Thanks.